And welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 opening credit sequences from my favorite TV shows. So in this video, I will count down my 10 favorite opening themes or opening sequences, because I am looking at the visuals too, not just the songs, and which ones I like the best. So it's basically... Usually when I'm watching a show, especially if you're binge watching a show, you get sick of the opening sequence, and if it's just decent or average, you kind of want to skip it. And you're watching it on a streaming service, you will utilize the skip intro feature, which I often do a lot, to be fair. But there's some shows where I never skip the intro. In fact, I feel kind of insulted for you even asking me because I love the intro, and the intro is part of what makes the show so great. In fact, some cases, the intro is the best part of the episode because the intro is so good, and it really, really works for me. So I will not be including any clips from the songs or intros, because I don't want this video banned or taken down, and which I think is actually really likely to happen, especially with music. So I'm being careful about that. So if you're complaining, oh, you're just talking the whole time, well, don't blame me, blame YouTube and their fucking copyright thing where they just ignore fair use. But anyway, also I'm not going to put links to the opening sequences, because I don't want the description of the video to be littered with links. You guys know how to use the search algorithm on YouTube. It's simple. Put in search, put in, Star Trek Voyager or Star Trek Enterprise opening sequence, opening theme, and boom, there you go. So if you're curious about it, you haven't seen any of these opening sequences, you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can look them up. Anyway, so... before I get into the opening sequence, now a lot of times when I do these best top 10 lists and my favorite, I'll do a worst list as well. I'll start off with the top 5 or top 3 worst. But as far as opening sequence, opening themes, opening titles, you guys know, there's only one worth mentioning for worst, and that is Star Trek Enterprise. Of course, it's the terrible. In the video, another video I did, I named it the worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. And I stand by that. It is definitely the worst opening theme, opening title sequence of any TV show ever. And I include, there have been some like really cheesy and horrible ones in the 70s or 80s, but those they're just outdated. This one always was terrible, and this one never fit the show, and it never worked, and it never made any sense. It was just a pathetic attempt from the showrunners to appeal to mass audiences, an attempt that failed miserably, and it sucked horribly. It is by far the worst opening sequence, not just in Star Trek, but in television, period. Anyway, that's it. That's all I gotta say. So now I gotta get into my top 10 best, and I must say that most of these are from the 90s onward. I don't really have any before then, because they are outdated and they are a bit cheesy, and also, like, that's mainly my focus. Whenever I do a list of favorite TV shows or anything related to that, it's usually 90s and up, having to do with when I was born in my lifetime, but also, I think there's modern television is called the golden age of television for a reason. I think it's the best it's ever been. So, and I think this applies to opening sequence, because I think it's worth talking about. In the 70s or 80s, they were a bit more cheesy and a bit more telegraphed. I just watched the Quantum Leap opening theme for the first time in decades, and I remember liking that before, but I remember, watching it now, I'm like, oh my god, this is so cheesy 80s. Anyway, I shouldn't hum, I might get demonetized. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going from the 90s upwards. But anyway, before I get into my top 10, let me start with a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my list. First honorable mention is the Battlestar Galactica theme. I'm, of course, talking about the newer version. It was really it starts off with this really somber orchestral music that I love. That I think is great, and it sets the tone for the somber tone of the show. But then it ends with like a more sort of almost militaristic, like excitable, intense music, which is also sets the tone of the theme of the show. I think the reason why I didn't make my top 10 is because they would show visuals in that second part where they were playing like the militaristic, intense music, and they would all show clips from the episode they're about to air, which I didn't like that because often it would spoil the episode. Like, I would be watching the episode, oh, I know this is coming because this was in the opening credits. So I think that was actually a poor decision to do it that way, that they should have kept the visuals the same every episode instead of trying to, have clips from the episode you're about to watch. Anyway, next honorable mention is Orphan Black. This is a somewhat short opening sequence. It's kind of to the point. The visuals are a bit psychedelic and trippy. But the music, I actually kind of really liked the music. I always liked how it ended. I'm not going to try to imitate it because I'll sound awful. But the ending sequence always got stuck in my head and always got me ready for each episode. Next honorable mention, which I tried to fit it into my top 10 because I really wanted this in my top 10, but I couldn't fit it in, so it's just on the edge of it, is Westworld. And I got to be honest, and I know I have a very different opinion of Westworld than basically everyone else in the world, who everyone else thinks that the first season was the best, and it slowly went downhill afterwards, where I thought the first season was clearly really overrated and not that good, and the show actually got better as it went. I think the same thing about the opening theme. Like, I always thought the opening theme was passable. Like, the music is decent, is good. But in the first two seasons, they were just showing visuals of, like, the clones being made, or, the robots or whatever. I can't remember the term they used, the hosts or whatever. But the artificial life forms being created and, like, Western motifs. And that's kind of dull to me. But, I love the fucking intro for season 3, just like I love season 3 of Westworld. I think it's not only clearly the best season of Westworld, but one of the best seasons of television ever made ever. But I remember that when I was watching season 3, I made a point to watch the opening sequence, and I loved it, and it really got me pumped and excited for the show, because then the visuals were about like that artificial, I can't remember what that thing was, a giant ball that was artificial, and it would show different parts of this modern world in a way that I thought to me was a lot more narratively interesting and relevant to the show than just images of westerns. And that combined with that even made the music of the theme sound even better to me, and really got me pumped for it. So yeah, that's why I didn't make my top 10, because I'm really focused on the season 3 part of it rather than the first two seasons. But I know everyone else thinks I'm wrong, but whatever. Anyway, now we'll get into my top 10 favorite opening sequence. And I'll start with my number 10, which is The Expanse. Now, the funny thing about The Expanse, if you're not familiar with my channel, it's one of my favorite shows of all time. I love the show to death. It's definitely my favorite show that's currently airing. But the funny thing is that I feel like others who like the show maybe less than me like the opening sequence more than me. I was never that enthralled with the opening sequence. That being said, I still love it. Obviously, I mean, it made my top 10. And I couldn't knock it out of the top 10. Because, it did, to me, a little bit when my first impression of it, particularly the music, was that it was trying to be like Battlestar Galactica. And the visuals was trying to be like Game of Thrones. And so it seemed like it was like emulating these other ones, trying to do a mix of Battlestar Galactica and Game of Thrones, which some people say use those terms to describe the show in general, that it's kind of a mix between Battlestar Galactica and Game of Thrones. And so the opening theme seemed to reflect that. However, the more the show went on, the more it became unique to the show, and the more it became its own thing. Particularly the visual. Now, the visuals are similar to Game of Thrones in terms of that it shows each location. In this case, it's not like a map of Westeros. It's like visuals of these planets that have been colonized. Which to me, at first, I didn't think it did a very good job of this, to be honest, in the first couple of seasons. But as the show went on and locations expanded, when we got the ring gates and stuff like that, I think the visuals reflected that more. Particularly season 5, where they actually would show like the progress of certain ships moving throughout the solar system and stuff like that, which I didn't even notice. It was so subtle, had to be pointed out to me. So I've learned to appreciate this opening sequence, and of course the music I do think is beautiful and really does set the tone for the show. So yes, this had to make my top 10, The Expanse. Now coming in at number 9 is actually Star Trek Voyager. Now I put this on my top 10 to represent Star Trek. This is the only Star Trek show I have in here. So I chose Voyager as the best Star Trek opening theme. Now, the Enterprise is clearly the worst. Fuck that show. And I might do my own video where I rank all of the Star Trek opening themes. That's actually been suggested, and I will get to that eventually. But now I'm spoiling what my number 1 will be. But it was between this and Next Generation. I think I like the Next Generation music the best, but this definitely has the best visuals and it has the next best music after Next Generation. So that combined, and I kind of don't like the visuals of the Next Gen because that's pretty substandard. It was based off the original series 1 where they have a name of the actor and then the ship would go zhoo, which is it is a bit cheesy, outdated, to be fair, and they were trying to be reminiscent of the original series, whereas with Voyager the visuals are stunning in this opening sequence. Like, they've really put a lot of time and effort into it to show the ship going through these nebulas and weird phenomenon, and I do think that the music is actually really great. Now, I think Deep Space Nine is a better show, but I think Voyager's got a better opening theme because, to be fair, I think the Deep Space Nine music is okay, but I think it's actually kind of dull, and I think the opening sequence in general is really dull because it just goes showing the station spinning around and playing this kind of stoic music. I mean, they tried to spice it up in season 4 with having the Defiant runabouts flying around, but it still felt dull compared to Voyager, particularly the music. I do think the music is much better. I sometimes I sing along. I've made my own lyrics to the music of Voyager, but the lyrics are basically Star Trek Voyager, and I just repeat that over and over again to the tune of the song, which I'm not going to do for you right now because I'm far too embarrassed. But basically, you could probably figure out how I do it. But anyway, so I had to go with Voyager as one of the best opening sequences. Anyway, we'll get into my number 8, a very recent show, a show that I don't think is that amazing. It's decent, like, it's interesting. I'm definitely curious to watch more seasons. Only one season that's aired so far. It's a show called Raised by Wolves. The opening sequence is one of the things that stuck out to me immediately. It is this show has is like post-apocalyptic and about Earth being destroyed by war, and they're going to another planet to try to colonize it, but they're bringing the war and their prejudices and everything with them. And so it's a very, very bleak show, and the opening sequence really, really reflects that. The visuals show like visuals of Earth being destroyed and of carnage and of apocalypse, and the music itself is it's a beautiful song. I think I misinterpreted the lyrics. I looked it up at one stage, but I can't remember. But it sounded like they were saying everything is lost. But I don't think that's actually what she was saying, but that's what it sounded like. But I think the lyrics, even though they're not as bleak as I thought they were, there's still like there's a really melancholic feel of that song, and the way they kind of tune the audio a bit to make it sound a bit like echoey as well, to go along with just how bleak everything is. And I think this opening sequence, more than anything else, really sold me on this show. And part of what kept me coming back, of course, the show itself is good, but I was really impressed. Now we'll get to number 7 on my list. Now, in more modern times, in the 2000s, some shows that became, especially for some serialized shows, that became commonplace to move away from the traditional long opening sequence that had the cast list and produced by, and it had the heroic music and played clips from the show, and it became more commonplace to just have like a really brief sort of card just flash out and say what the show is. The most common examples, or well-known examples, would be Lost, where it just had the title go, and it would last like a couple seconds, and then 24, which is one that had like the digital clock going 24, and that's it. So this became very commonplace in the 2000s, and it's still used in modern times. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because my number 7 is one such sequence. Now, at first, when I was comprising that list, I thought I wouldn't include any of them because, it's especially one like Lost, like it doesn't really, it's not the same thing. It doesn't really hold up to one of these longer opening sequences that has drawn out music and visuals that really set the tone for the show. It's just a very brief boom, and that's it. And so it's not as impressive to me. However, my number 7 is Loki, the show that just came out, because even though the visuals for this is very brief, it only lasts like 5-6 seconds, I love it to death. It always really got to me and got me in the mood to watch the show. Like when I go to turn on the show, I'll be like, oh, do I really want to watch Loki? Okay, let's just watch Loki. And then as soon as those opening credits hit, I was like, oh my god, I'm ready for Loki. This is going to be amazing. Because it's just the kind of music that they use is very sort of, it's hard for me to describe it. It does seem a bit classic or a bit nostalgic. It's not really modern. It's more of like something you would find in the 70s or 80s. But it really fits the tone of the show. The sort of godlike figure of Loki combined with the bureaucratic 70s-ish style of the TVA. And the way that it has the title sequence of Loki, that each letter will flash and constantly change to different fonts. Like all 4 letters will change different fonts constantly. That sort of signify the nature of dealing with alternate timelines and splinter timelines. That combined with the music really got to me. Even though this is a very brief sequence, not a full one, things still deserved a place on my list. Alright, so next we'll get into my number 6. This is the opening sequence. Sometimes I thought was the best part of the episode, and it was definitely one that I always watched every time and never skipped, is Black Sails. And I gotta admit, it's mainly for the music, but I think that these visuals do complement the music well. The visuals is like a sort of, it zooms in different aspects of it looks like a marble sculpture of pirates invading a ship, or invading another ship. That's what it looks like to me. And so they just zoom in on different figurines and this marble sculpture while the music plays, and that's all well and good, but this music is fucking amazing. I think this is something a lot of people agree on. The music is really gets you pumped for this show about pirates, and it starts off kind of like slow and meanders into it, but then it really gets going, and I'm so tempted to hum the song, but I'm not going to do it because it's so damn good. And when I say it was the best part of the episode, I'm mainly referring to season 1, because season 1 was kind of average, but the show of course got better, and I think this even when the show got really bleak and dark towards the end of its show's run during season 4, the theme still fit, and it still really got you pumped for the kind of pirate action you're about to see. So always impressed with that. So now we'll get into my number 5, an opening sequence, much like the show itself, one that sort of grew on me, that I wasn't that huge into at first, but the more I saw it, the more I liked it. And now, absolutely never skip this, is BoJack Horseman. The visuals do change from season to season to reflect what season is. I think in season 6, the final season, they actually show each aspect of the sequence, shows earlier episodes throughout the whole season, so sort of celebrating the show as a whole, which I fucking love. And also, like, it features the various main characters, but these characters sometimes change their looks and appearance, and the opening sequence will reflect that. And the theme itself is very it's a bit somber, melancholic. It's almost funky, but in a sort of somber way, if that makes any sense. I think it has, if I remember correctly, the bassist from the Black Keys did this with a famous saxophonist, and it was just like something they were jamming together on their own free time, but they submitted it to the show. So they didn't write it for the show, but they submitted it to the show and they thought the showrunners thought it did sort of describe the kind of sort of somber, introspective feeling that they were going for. And they even pointed out, like, at one stage, that in season 1, of course, starts off with like a silly, goofy comedy, almost Family Guy-esque, which really gives you a false impression of what the show's actually going to be like for its 6-season run. But the showrunner pointed out that the theme is the main thing that gives you the hint that this is not it's not a silly, over-the-top, goofy comedy, that there is more of a somber, thoughtful theme to it, and that the opening sequence is your biggest hint on that. And I did get quite enthralled with this song and downloaded it and listened to it in my own free time. I listened to like the full-length version of it, but yeah, and I think what they did with that, and apparently, like, they were stuck between this and the other song that they play a different song over the ending credits, which is sort of, I don't want to say punk rock, but it's kind of more upbeat. And they wrote the song specifically for the show, and because it's about BoJack Horseman back in the 90s. I'm not going to sing. Anyway, so they were stuck between that, but they thought that this more somber approach was the better for the opening credits, and that the more upbeat thing was better for the ending credits, which I actually loved. It was a brilliant decision, because especially the episodes that end very on a sort of shocking note or very somber or dark note, because I love the contrast between that, that dark note and that really upbeat music. And then, of course, there's times where they change the opening sequence for comedic purposes, particularly when they had that episode about Bobo, the angsty zebra, and they had the same music, but it was played over everyone was, the different characters that they were portraying in that. If you've seen the episode, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, that's my number 5, BoJack Horseman. So we'll get to my number 4, which, I'm sorry, but it's going to be impossible for me to say this without humming it. Dun, 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 the X-Files. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the X-Files. Honestly, I think the show is a little bit overrated. I binge watched the show, I think twice, if I believe that. And it's a hard show to binge watch. And I think I talked about this recently, how I think half the show is a masterpiece and the other half is absolute garbage. It's the most sort of contrasty back and forth, like in terms of quality, between excellent and some of the best storytelling I've ever seen to absolute garbage. And it's not like the excellent parts outnumber the garbage part. I think they're almost equal. And so in that case, it was a hard show to get through. But the one, even through the garbage episodes, the one bright spot was that opening scene. And part of what makes this opening sequence so great is the way that they use it. Now, it's almost like a trope because they almost do it in every episode, but it always works. Is that they'll have an opening sequence that doesn't typically, I mean, this changes sometimes, but typically it doesn't portray our main characters. It has a random guest of the week, whoever that may be, and some weird, funky, paranormal shit happens to them at the end of the sequence. Like an alien will pop up or a monster will pop up and go rah, or something like really weird, and some weird shit's gonna happen, and it hard cuts to that first like hard beat of the opening sequence, dun, 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 like, and that gives such. That's one of my favorite things about the show overall. And there's other shows. There's one other that kind of does it that you'll see later on my list, but I think this one does that aspect of it better, even though I think that other one's a bit better for other reasons. But this one, yeah, is definitely the best. And I've seen some other shows like Fringe try to do that too, and Fringe almost made my honorable mention, but not quite. But I don't think either, even though I do think the first 3 seasons of Fringe was a better show than the X-Files, but we don't talk about season 4 or 5. But I think the X-Files did the opening sequence better. Just that feeding into that contrast of like scary shit happening and the hard cut to the spooky music that is really like low beat and gets you in the mood. I think this opening sequence is basically the best aspect of the show. Anyway, we'll get into my number 3, which is Humans. Now, Humans also kind of starts like boom, get you into it, but it's a different feel than, say, the X-Files or Fringe or the other show I'm about to mention. What I love with Humans, and Humans was a more kind of character-based show. It was about, androids and them existing in real life, but they tried to play it somewhat realistically, and it was more of a... Yeah, it was more character-based and more, especially the first season, it was more just about a family or whatever, so it was a lot more sort of low-key. So they would have, so it wouldn't have these, grand teasers like, say, the X-Files would that was meant to spook you out or something. It would just be, dialogue-based, setting up the episode. But what I love is how the opening theme, particularly in later seasons, would jump into it, where they would actually tease the first robotic notes of the sequence. You would hear that before the opening sequence would actually start, so it would go derp, and then it would cut, and then the visuals would cut with it, and you would go straight into the opening sequence, which again, it's kind of similar to Westwood. I liked better in season 3, even though season 3 is not my favorite season of Humans. I think the first season was the best, but I like the opening theme the best in season 3 because the opening theme, the visuals in the first 2 seasons, particularly season 1, was just like a bunch of androids and artificial life forms in their early creation, and they even have some audio clips of news or commercial videos promoting artificial life forms and stuff like that, which I like, don't get me wrong, I think it was great. But in season 3, the theme of season 3 had more to do with the artificial life form revolution, and so the visuals more matched that. It showed protests and artificial life forms being mutilated and destroyed, or artificial life forms fighting for the rights and stuff so that was a lot more. Even though I thought season 3 itself was a mixed bag, but that opening sequence was a lot more sort of enthralling and a lot more, so it got me more excited for what I was about to watch. But I always like that theme song. I always think that really worked to get me hyped up for the show, especially since it was, the teaser usually didn't do it because it was more of a character-based thing and it was just dialogue-based or whatever. But that opening theme was like, nah, get excited for this show, and I think it always worked, always my favorite. So that's my number 3. So now I'm gonna get to my number 2, which is a show I recently watched and reviewed on my channel, and that is The Otter Limits. Now, the 90s version, of course, I think the 60s version of this thing was stupid, just like the show. I didn't really care for it as much. But the 90s version, of course, was a redux of the 60s version, but they updated it. And I think that combination of doing, because the 60s one is like, there's nothing wrong with their television. We're about to experience the awe and mystery of the Otter Limits. Like, which, I'm sorry, that does not work for me. But the 90s version took that same tone, but updated it and made it, and the visuals is fucking amazing. Like, the visuals are like really creepy and sort of are meant to sort of be like delusions or illusions and kind of mess with your mind. At the same time, you had this audio, like the music is really well done too. Like, it's much better of the really creepy music, and of course you had the voiceover. There's nothing wrong with your television. We now control everything you see and hear. Like, it's just brilliant. And this is the one thing, like, when I watched this recently on a streaming service, they always say skip intro. I would get insulted. Like, how dare you even suggest I skip this intro? This intro is the best part of the episode. Like, it's just done so well, and it really gets you in the mood for that creepy feel that most episodes pull off. But it's also, again, this is when I was referencing earlier that's similar to the XFiles, although I think the XFiles does this aspect of it better, but we're do the same kind of gimmick where we start with the teaser and some weird shit would happen, an alien would pop out or some shit to freak you out, and it would hard cut to the dun 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 dun, there's nothing wrong with your television. Now, it's not as jarring of a hard cut as the XFiles one, which is why I think the XFiles one works better. However, the way the whole sequence progresses gets creepier and creepier, which is different than the X-Files, which is pretty stagnant, and I think the opening notes are the creepiest part of that theme, whereas Outer Limits builds and builds until it gets to the end. You're about to experience the awe and mystery. It reaches to the deepest in the minds, to the Outer Limits. I just said that wrong, but whatever, you know what it means. And so that by the end of it, you're like, you're like ready to go and watch some really creepy shit. So yeah, that is my second favorite opening sequence. So now we'll get into my number 1 favorite opening sequence, and it is still Game of Thrones. I'm going to do a video one of these days about how I just don't like this show as much anymore because the last 2 seasons kind of ruined the whole thing for me. But I still got to admit that the opening sequence is definitely the best. And I kind of hinted at, I talked earlier about how the 2000s brought out the very short, like Lost or 24-esque, like just 5-second, intro, we're over. I think Game of Thrones is probably the main one that broke that theme and started to bring back the longer, more drawn out opening sequence. I know it's not the only one to do it. It wasn't the first one after, to do it, but I think it's the most prominent, and that sort of inspired other shows to do more longer opening sequence and not just do the cheat of a boom, here's the title, let's go. Now, the music, of course, was absolutely amazing and really got you pumped up for some really intense fantasy action, medieval time-based whatever show, but of course the visuals were fucking amazing. How they had a digital map of Westeros, and they went to each location, and of course the locations change per episode. Now, typically it would change per season, but sometimes it would be per episode. Sometimes if the characters went to a location that they didn't go to previously, they would show that, like River Run in season 3. But when they left River Run, then River Run was no longer on the map. Then they went to the Twins, so then the Twins would be on the map, and so they would focus on each location. In fact, in some ways, this could spoil the episode too, because if you saw a particular location, like when I saw Bravos for the first time, I was like, "Oh my God, Bravos!" Like when you see a particular location, you're like, "Okay, they're going to that location in this episode," but that wasn't like, they never spoiled it too badly. It was never like the Battlestar Galactica one where, you know, that would spoil the episode too much. This one would just give you an inkling of which locations, and sometimes there were your standard locations that they had. Like I think the 3 that they had in every single opening sequence was King's Landing, Winterfell, and The Wall, and they would be, I think they were in there every opening sequence they ever did, even though there were some episodes where we didn't get those locations, particularly Winterfell. For a while after it burned, there was a long time we didn't see it at all, but it was still in the opening sequence, but it was burning to reflect the fact that it had been burning, which I like again. And then of course when the Boltons took it over in season 5, they put up Bolton flags during the opening sequence, but then when the Starks took it back, then they put back the Starks symbols. Like, it's that kind of attention to detail that I absolutely love. And of course, like they would show also on the map, they would go to Essos briefly and show where Daenerys was, and of course that would change depending on which location she went to as well, which again, that combined with the music, which was again some of the best music ever used in opening sequence. So this still remains my favorite opening theme of any show. So anyway, that is it for my top 10 opening sequences of any TV shows. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and possibly even support me on Patreon, which of course would be extremely helpful. Anyway, you can check out my channel as I do more videos on other shows, such as a Star Trek Better Call Saul. I'm doing Star Trek The Expanse, Better Call Saul, and Star Wars The Clone Wars. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.